All right. I often tell you to look at the bigger picture. In this video and in coming videos, I'm going to give training on how to look at the bigger picture. Look, I'm not assuming you're dumb, okay? But even if you're dumb, I don't care. I'm happy you're here, that you're willing to learn, okay? So in this video, I'm just going to give practical examples how you can look at the bigger picture. I didn't want to make this video because I didn't want to insult you, okay? Because sometimes I explain the most obvious things too often. But you know what? I'll do it anyway for those that need it. So, okay. For those that come from the United States, in high school you heard about the history of the Louisiana Purchase. How the United States purchased the Louisiana territory from France. And then the year afterwards, because in 1803 they made the purchase, in 1804 they sent Lewis and Clark to perform an expedition throughout the territory. And you were taught this in high school. Your high school teacher just did his or her job. They didn't intend any wrong on you or anything like that. So that's the history you got and how the United States expanded. But okay, let's think about that narrative for a moment. The United States purchases a territory from France, or actually from Napoleon. And if you look at the history of Napoleon at the time, he needed money to finance his wars in Europe. So the United States offered him a lot of money. And if you go to the amount of it, it's 60 million francs. And if you look at the condition of the United States back then, they were in financial difficulties. Okay, so that's a bit of the background information. And here's another thing. France in 1800 received that territory back from Spain because Spain ruled that territory. It was Spanish Louisiana then. So the Spaniards governed that place. And the Spaniards offered back to Napoleon. Napoleon received it back from Spain, but Napoleon had no intention of having to spend all that money on the territory. So when the United States offered money, Napoleon said, yes, we do. But here's the thing. Spain wanted to get rid of the territory because it cost a lot of money. France didn't want it, but the United States, that was in turmoil, that was in financial difficulty, they took it. What? Come on now. Does this add up to you? Okay, let's say that, that you have a guy who's in debt and his income is low, and now he wants to spend 4,000 bucks, 4,000 euros in purchasing a brand new car. And that car is a car that nobody wants because the car is not only is the car a bit expensive, but the car uses a lot of gasoline. So once you purchase the car, you need to spend a lot of money in purchasing gasoline. So nobody wants the car. But now you have a guy who hears all about this, and yet he provides 4,000 euros while he's in debt. Does that add up? It doesn't add up, right? Okay, now let's look further. When Napoleon made the exchange, when Napoleon sold the territory to the United States, Spain was still there. Spain was still managing and governing the territory on behalf of France. So when the territory on paper became American, Spain was still managing the territory. And here's the thing. The United States just spent 60 million francs paying for the territory to Napoleon. So they didn't have any money to manage the territory. So Spain had to remain there for several years until the United States was ready to take the administration of that territory. And here's the thing, Spain already mapped out the north of America. Spain even had maritime bases all the way to Alaska. Alaska coming all the way to the Californias, which was part of Spanish Oregon. So the Spaniards already mapped out the whole territory, which tribes live there, how they relate to one another. So the United States government only had to request the documentations from the Spaniards, and the Spaniards had their documentation in Mexico City, as well as in Madrid. So they could have just sent diplomats to Mexico City, and they could have received copies of documentation, and they would have known everything about the Louisiana territory, which they just purchased from France. Why then did they send those two men on an expedition? You get what I'm saying here? Look, when you were in high school, they didn't tell you the whole context of the Spanish Empire, of the financial situation of the United States back then, and how it was in Europe. You didn't get the bigger picture. You didn't get the context behind it. So when they told you that story of Lewis and Clark, you believed it. Why would they lie to you? So I don't blame you that you believed it. But now I'm telling you to look beyond. When you look beyond and evaluate the situation, the context as it was then, that story of Lewis and Clark doesn't add up at all. First of all, why would the United States pay so much money for a territory that was very expensive to manage, while the United States itself was still in a mess? Because remember, the majority of the British population in the colonies did not support the independence. And there was still resistance against that new country called the United States by its own citizens. The United States was just developing its navy, because they even had their own navy. And their military was quite tiny. So why would they want to spend so much money, which they could have spent far better, on purchasing a territory that was quite expensive to maintain? Now, they did purchase the territory. That's a fact. But Spain was still there. So why would they send an expedition while it was already mapped out by Spain? And remember, Spain was, I would say, the number one supporter of the independence of the United States. Spain even conceded parts of Spanish Florida to the United States. Spain assisted the United States a lot. So why would the United States send out an expedition in a territory that has been governed by Spain for so long? Spain was experienced in managing a territory. I mean, come on. If you look at the whole context, so the Lewis and Clark thing doesn't add up. It just falls apart. Now, I'm not going to guess what the real purpose was of the Lewis and Clark expedition. But the reason they are using this Lewis and Clark expedition is to take your attention away from the real historical processes that are going on. Because one thing you need to understand, history does not repeat itself, because history is just the events that happen. But history does rhyme. When people say history repeats itself, they really are saying that similar things are happening over and over again. What was going on back then was that amongst the US citizens, there was a lot of strife. And there was collective violence being used on parts of the US population. That's why the economy was so messed up. That's why the diplomacy was also messed up. So, by purchasing Louisiana, an impression was made that this new country, the United States, was worth it. So, those two men being sent out to so-called mapped territory, that story is used to cover up the fact that the United States as a country was not supported by the majority of its inhabitants. So you'll never hear about that part of US history. You'll hear of the Louisiana Purchase and how afterwards the migrants came, about the Civil War. So that period between the early 1800s and the Civil War, that is a gap. Okay? And here's the thing. Why would France want to sell Louisiana if France was in desperate need of having more territory? Well, that was one exercise for you about the Lewis and Clark expedition. Now, I'm not into conspiracy theories here, I'm just telling you to look beyond, to evaluate things. Okay, let's go to another example now. Let's go to, okay, let me think of a good historical event. Okay, you have this country, this empire called Japan. This country has been closed off from the outside world for 200 years. It was a feudal society of samurai lords. And these samurai lords were under the kingship of the daimyo. And the daimyo were under the emperor. Now, you have this ship coming from the Americas, from Commodore Perry. It's a steamship. It comes with some troops, and he forces the Japanese to open their ports for American trade. And the Japanese realize then, oh dear, we're lagging behind, so we need to modernize. So, when Crown Prince Mutsuhito became emperor at age 15, he announced Meiji reforms. It's going to be a new era in Japan. Now hold on a minute. If the country had been closed off for 200 years and most people couldn't even speak a native language, how could it be then that those nobles understood and could communicate with the Americans? If the majority of the population never knew anything about foreign countries because they were so closed off, how then within 10 years there were ambassadors from Japan going to the major capitals in Europe to gain knowledge? When you just look at the facts of this history that's been told onto you, you'll see that there are things that doesn't add up here. Now there's one thing that's left out of this history. Spain, a Catholic superpower back then, also had territory in Asia called the Philippines. The Philippines was an autonomous kingdom established by Spain. And through the Philippines, Spain traded with the Chinese Empire, the Korean Kingdom, and also Japan. Because Japan had to trade with other countries, they just didn't want foreigners in their country. But here's the thing, in Japan, where foreigners were banned, there were many Roman Catholics. And those Roman Catholics were wealthy. Why? Because they kept contact with Roman Catholics in the Spanish Empire. Remember, the Spanish Empire, especially New Spain, that part of the Spanish Empire was quite rich. So there was a lot of wealth being transferred between North America and Asia through the Spanish trade with China. So the Roman Catholics were quite rich over there, also in Japan, because Roman Catholicism was embraced by some of the elites in Japan. I believe in 1600s, there was this king of Sendai who sent out diplomats to Spain. But the king of Spain did not want to acknowledge the diplomats because it was not sent by the emperor, it was sent by the local king. But one of the royal households of Japan, not the imperial household, one of the local royals was Roman Catholic. And despite that, Roman Catholicism became forbidden, as well as the gospel itself. Roman Catholics remained influential. They even developed secret codes how to communicate with one another. So, when the Roman Catholics kept increasing in power, there came a point that they wanted a takeover. And in the United States back then, there were many Roman Catholics living, because remember, half of the United States territory was Spanish territory. After the independence from Mexico, it became Mexican territory for a while. And the United States took half of Mexico's territory. But the people that lived within that territory were already Roman Catholic. So the Roman Catholic population of the USA increased. So Spanish remained relevant. So, what happened? In order for the United States to have trade with Asia, they couldn't depend on the Spanish trade anymore because the viceroyalty of New Spain did not exist anymore. And Mexico was in a very bad condition internally. So they needed to use the Roman Catholics to get access to Japan. So Roman Catholics from within Japan, together with the Spanish Roman Catholics from the Philippines, as well as the Catholics that lived in the conquered territory of the USA on the Pacific coast, they worked together into forcing the local, the national elite of Japan to embrace open trade. Okay? So that is what happened. That's why very soon, after Japan opens itself, diplomats went everywhere. But here's the thing, those diplomats, they spoke the languages in Europe. Okay? How come? Because Roman Catholics had universities everywhere where you could learn foreign languages. So the Roman Catholics of Japan, they could understand multiple languages because they could attend Catholic universities. And in Japan, there were underground institutions of the Roman Catholics where you could also learn stuff. And here's the thing, the Roman Catholics in Japan were backed up financially by the Roman Catholics of the former Spanish territories in the Americas, as well as by Spain itself. So, when you look at the bigger picture, the opening of Japan to what they call the Western world was really a Roman Catholic takeover. But the country was not forced to build cathedrals everywhere, but it was a Roman Catholic takeover. And today, Roman Catholics are the #1 religious power in Japan. They are a minority of the total 124 million Japanese. But nevertheless, they're economically so powerful. How come they're economically so powerful? Because it was their ancestors who were Roman Catholics in Japan that forced the country to get along with international trade, which was led after by Roman Catholics. Again, I used the example of the Lewis and Clark expedition and the example of Japan opening the Western world to show you that there was more going on back then. And when you look at the bigger picture, you'll begin to notice things. When you look at the bigger picture, don't just look at the facts, look around the facts. And use your imagination. Your imagination is not something bad, it's something good. Use it. And also look at the background information. All that is important in looking at the bigger picture. Now, I'll make more videos coming days in training you how to look at the bigger picture because I believe this will benefit you. I will not only talk about historic events, I will use parables also. But anyway, that's it for today. Agree with Christ and be at peace.